Welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society's virtual tour with Historic Newton. I would like to point out that we have about 90 people in the webinar, so we can probably all be relatively thankful that this is a virtual tour rather than trying to cram 90 people into a historic home, which would probably not be the most enjoyable tour ever. We're going to be joined shortly by Clara Silverstein, who is the Community Engagement Manager for Historic Newton. But just to let you know the process that we're going to go through. We are going to first have a very brief introduction from me explaining a little bit about Newton, where it is, a little bit about the history, and then Clara is going to show us some of the historic Newton properties, and following that, Clara and I are going to have a brief conversation, and then we will open it up to the audience for questions. So it should be around a 20-minute presentation, a 20-minute conversation, and 20 minutes for a Q&A. So, Newton, Mass. I imagine many people here already know something about Newton, so I won't go into too great of depth talking about Newton, but if there's anyone who's joining us who isn't from the area or hasn't visited Newton, this will be a little bit of a primer for what they're seeing. So this is where Newton is in relationship to Boston. So it is a western suburb of Boston. As you can see, it is actually geographically quite a large suburb, one of the larger ones within Route 128. And in terms of the population of Newton, you can get a sense here of what Newton looks like. This is from the federal census. It shows that the population of Newton is estimated in 2017 to have been around 88,000. So it's a substantial community. It is primarily white, 77% white, with African-American populations and a relatively large and growing Asian-American population, and then smaller American Indian and Hispanic populations. The average family household, most households are family households, making up about a little under 70%, and then non-family households make up about a little bit over 30%. So lots of families in Newton. This is a relatively typical suburban community, and also a relatively sizable percentage of people who are over the age of 65. As you'll see with most communities, I'm also here comparing this to Boston on the far right. So you can see demographically how Newton compares to Boston. Boston obviously is a much larger community, obviously a different breakdown in terms of diversity, and also different in terms of how many households are family households versus non-family households, and how many units are owner-occupied versus rental-occupied. So you can see that there's a clear distinction between Newton and Boston, with Boston being more urban and Newton being more suburban. However, if you were to compare Newton to many of the neighboring communities, Newton is actually relatively diverse and a little bit closer to what Boston, Cambridge, or Somerville, or the inner ring cities look like. So this is the population of Newton over time. Again, this is based on US federal census data. So you can see it growing from a very, very small community gradually in the 19th century without any huge uptick until you get to the really towards the end of the 19th century, and then a pretty rapid growth into the 1960s, and then a little bit of a leveling off and a dip in the 1980s and 90s, and then sort of a regrowth following the turn of the millennium. If you compared this graph to a graph of Boston or Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, the sort of inner core, you would see a little bit of a difference in that the population in Boston would peak a little bit earlier and then would start a relatively precipitous decline, but then the bounce back would start around the same time, maybe a little bit earlier in Boston. And that's just the differences between suburban versus urban communities. So a little bit about the history of Newton. So the first settlement goes back to 1630. It was originally a part of Newtown, which was renamed Cambridge in 1638. It was incorporated as a separate town, originally known as Cambridge Village, in 1681. Which makes it relatively early as a town breaking off from Cambridge. Many communities in Massachusetts and New England were once a part of a different community, so that's a very common attribute. And while Cambridge is relatively well known today as what Cambridge is, Cambridge in the 17th century was actually geographically gigantic and included communities from Concord to Brighton to Billerica. So really was a very large area. So it was renamed Newtown in 1691 and finally Newton in 1766. It was later incorporated as a city. It had a relatively active water mill and was the site of a number of early industries, including chocolate, glue, paper, among others. It was also the site of an early maker of an automobile, the Stanley Motor Carriage Company. So that was an interesting one, and became a relatively early commuter suburb into Boston with the completion of the Boston and Worcester Railroad line in 1834, which is really quite early for a commuter suburb. It's also notable that the Boston Marathon runs through the city, and it is actually the home of Heartbreak Hill. So one thing that's also interesting about Newton being very geographically large, it has a whole series of different neighborhoods and different communities. So you can be in Newton, but be a part of one of 13 different sort of neighborhoods or sub-communities within Newton. So without further ado, we are now going to go to showing a short video, and then Clara and I will have a conversation.
Well, that's the sound of pebbles hitting the window at the Jackson Homestead, a historic house in Newton, Massachusetts. You know, between 1 and 2 a.m., one night in the 19th century, someone actually came and threw pebbles at the second-story window to wake up owner William Jackson and let him know that a freedom seeker needed his assistance as a safe place to stay overnight, because he was escaping slavery in the South, and his master was in Boston looking for him. William Jackson took him in, and we now know that this was a stop on the Underground Railroad. I'm Clara Silverstein, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Historic Newton. This is one of 2 museums that Historic Newton operates, and I'd like to take you inside and tell you more. This house was built in 1809 by William Jackson, and he was using land that had been in the Jackson family since the 17th century. William lived here for the rest of his life. He died in 1855, and his daughter Ellen lived here and wrote about life at the Jackson Homestead in a memoir that she called Annals of the Old Homestead in the 1890s. And from that, we know about the Jackson Homestead as a part of the Underground. Behind me is William Jackson and his wife, Mary Bennett Jackson. The legacy of their work through the Underground Railroad and their interest in social justice issues is at the heart of Historic Newton today. We present many programs connecting past and present by talking about social justice and activism in the past to activities now that have to do with this theme. This room is often filled with student groups, and they are from preschool through high school. We also have many adult learners coming to the Jackson Homestead, and one of the programs that we frequently offer is called Journey on the Underground Railroad. Our philosophy of education is to be more the guide on the side, asking people to consider the decisions that people made throughout history, rather than the sage on the stage telling people what happened and when. We like for people to take an active part in the history that we're talking about. Many of our public programs also address social justice themes. We had a panel discussion with members of the Black Lives Matter movement from local universities, including Boston College, after they saw clips of a film about the abolitionists. What was their reaction to 19th century activism? How does it compare to what they're doing today? Last year, with funding from the Mass Cultural Council, as well as the Newton Cultural Council, we were able to bring in programs about groups who've traditionally been marginalized from the historical narrative. Groups who've been marginalized by race, by sexual orientation or gender identity, as well as disability. For the disability program, we partnered with students from Gann Academy who had done extensive research into the Fernald School in Waltham, and they shared that research with us and brought to light some of their thoughts about how to tell the history of people who've been disabled. We also held a program on the Newton Center Green, inviting community members to read sections of Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And this gave people a chance to hear the powerful speech and to think about what it might have to do with their lives today. A lot of our programs are based on research into primary sources in Newton. One of our staff members is currently doing extensive genealogical research on the lives of African Americans who lived in Newton in the 1700s and is able to present that at upcoming programs. In partnership with the Newton Free Library and the Newton Senior Center, we've been running a program called Newton Talks, where we've interviewed residents about topics including immigration and discrimination. This is a nice resource for people to use in their research. We've archived the material on YouTube as well as at the Newton Free Library. We also, for earlier immigration in the 19th century, have been developing an education program that looks at immigrants from 3 communities: Chinese, Jewish, and Irish. All came to Newton in the 19th century. The Confronting Our Legacy exhibit at the Jackson Homestead takes the history that we know about the Jackson family and builds on it to talk about slavery in the North, and especially the history in Newton of slavery and anti-slavery. This shows different branches of the Jackson family over time. I mentioned that William Jackson had built the house on land owned by his ancestors, and some of them were slave owners. So we're talking and looking at how did the history change over time, and what were some of the influences on people to become activists against slavery. The anti-slavery movement involved people of all genders and white as well as African American people. This panel shows the history of some of the residents of Newton, including Sarah Redmond, who was an anti-slavery lecturer. One of the more interesting Jackson family members is Francis, William's brother, who was very active in Boston. He was instrumental in creating a vigilance committee to assist freedom seekers. He also was one of the people who encouraged Frederick Douglass to give a public speech at a meeting of an anti-slavery society on Nantucket, and this really helped launch Douglass's career as a public speaker. Part of the exhibit also looks at the African American community in Newton after the Civil War ended, when people were more free to move around the country. And this focuses on Natal Baptist Church, which is a church that a group of African Americans created in 1874 and is still active today. Newton's second history museum, the Durant Kenrick House and Grounds, was built as a farmhouse in 1734. It opened as part of historic Newton in 2014, and the bright green color is historically accurate. Like the Jackson Homestead, this museum interprets issues of social justice. Its first owners, the family of Edward Durant II, was active in civic and business affairs. Edward's grandsons fought at Lexington and Concord. They also did own enslaved people. The next owners, the Kenricks, purchased the property in 1790. John Kenrick was an early abolitionist who published The Horrors of Slavery in 1817. In a case of history repeating itself, a group in Boston, the Boston Poets Theater, presented a play, The Abolitionists, at the Durant-Kenrick House. It was giving the history of abolitionists in Boston, and John Kenrick was one of the people whose quotes were used in the play. It was presented in the education wing, which was added to the home during the renovation in 2014 when Historic Newton acquired the property. But the Kenricks were best known for their activities in gardening. They planted orchards all around the property and shipped fruit to many different places in the United States. Our gardens interpret this history and have many sample trees that talk about what the Kenricks did and how they contributed to horticulture in Massachusetts and beyond. Newton's two history museums and the stories of the families who lived in them certainly provide much material for programs that we do, but we also look beyond the four walls for other opportunities to interpret local history. The overall mission of Historic Newton is to inspire discovery and engagement by interpreting our community's history in the context of American history. The theme of activism is one of many that we do talk about, but we feel like it's a very important one. It reflects a dynamic spirit within American history of people making change and looking for opportunities to think broadly about social justice. And we're very proud to have a legacy to build on to interpret this theme. We hope to see you at our online programs now and at our two museums when it's safe to reopen. And thank you for listening to today's presentation.
Very much for that great presentation. I'm sure people would have a great time visiting once it's safe to visit. And I just wanted to extend a special thank you to you for actually going to the historic sites with, I think you had a cell phone and a selfie stick and creating the video tour. So that's really going above and beyond to create something new for us. So I have a few questions for you. And I know that you have a couple slides to go along with those questions. And then we're going to move on to the Q&A from the audience. So my first question is, can you reflect on how Historic Newton works to respond to national stories and to help contextualize those stories for local residents?
Well, certainly right now, there's so much social action and protest for social justice that it's a very important time to contextualize some of what's going on. And we think it's very helpful to show that the needle has been moved in different eras and how hard it can be for that to happen. We have a slide of the handcuffs that Anthony Burns wore, and this was on display at Historic Newton for many years. And it shows that during that time, Anthony Burns was a freedom seeker from Virginia who came up to Boston and didn't want to go back, but because of the fugitive slave law, his master came looking for him and he was going to be extradited. there was a huge street protest in Boston, and one of the people who went was Nathaniel Allen, who ran a school in Newton, and he was arrested there. He was let go eventually, but that's just some context for what was happening in the 19th century. There are street protests now in Newton. I have a couple of slides of those. This was a march that took place. It went from West Newton to Newtonville, ended at Newton City Hall. It was a Black Lives Matter protest. There was also in the next slide a protest. It was more of it was 8 minutes of silence on the Newton Center Green. So we can show that things are happening now. We also talk about how things happened before, and again, the struggle to make this change. It's not a simple process. We think that's important for people to realize.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing that. Real people have real flaws, and there's a danger in local history of only telling good stories about people. There can be a sense that visitors want to hear uplifting stories and don't want the complication of a person in the past who did good things but also said, believed, or did things that are no longer acceptable. Can you talk about how Historic Newton works to present full histories, even including the flaws of some of your more famous former residents?
Well, William Jackson is a perfect example of this. He certainly was today what we would consider a hero for opening his home to the Underground Railroad. But he was very principled in other ways. He was a huge temperance advocate to the point where he opened a bank that was encouraging people to put their money in the bank rather than spending it on drinking, which is not necessarily a flaw, but he did fail in various business ventures. There's a candle venture that is in the next slide that he ran out of his home for a time. That did not do all that well. He ended up selling off some of his land to raise money. He's certainly not the first person who did that. But in that process, he created what is known as Newton's first subdivision. It's land behind the Jackson Homestead. And at the time, we have a walking tour where we talk about this. He was definitely trying to sell the property by, we call it puffing up the value of it. And so we do try to give a well-rounded picture of him. Also, I'll briefly mention his brother Francis, whom you saw in the video. Francis was also very involved in anti-slavery activities and was part of the Underground Railroad. He actually had Frederick Douglass as a house guest at one point, and we have correspondence we've seen between the two where Frederick Douglass writes him a thank you letter about that. But in his will, Francis left a lot of his money to these liberal causes, and other members of the family contested the will. So it just gives a fuller picture. We try not to create these heroes without talking about them in fuller detail.
Great. Thank you. So I find it very interesting that Historic Newton has a very strong focus on social justice. How did your organization come to have that focus? And along the same lines, as I mentioned in the introduction, Newton is a suburban community. So who is accessing these presentations? Is it just Newton residents, or do you work with a larger audience?
Sure. So that's kind of a two-part question. Certainly I was talking in the video about how we're building on the Underground Railroad legacy. We're part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, which is a network of many, many sites around the country. And that certainly helped. But also Newton has a very long tradition of activism, and people from Newton have been involved in the civil rights movement. They've also have been very involved in the peace movement. There was a vigil at Newton Center Green. I believe it was every week for years and years for peace. We recently ran a photo of people protesting in the 1970s on Newton Center Green, and then that was run in juxtaposition with that 8 minutes of silence that I showed. So we definitely have this long tradition of activism. We now serve. You saw the demographics of Newton and our population. Certainly, we're there to interpret our community's stories, but we are happy to interpret them for any school groups that want to visit. We reach out in the greater Boston area to groups, and we've had them come from all over, especially in a normal summer. We have many, many camp groups that come from all over Boston. It's a wonderful field trip for them because they can go indoors and see the museums, have a program, eat their lunch outdoors. So we really do try to go beyond the borders of Newton and who we serve. A third group that comes when the museums are open would be visitors from around the country and also around the world. And we've had some very interesting conversations with visitors about their perceptions of the Underground Railroad. So that's another group that we serve. These boys were at a camp fair and they're playing with historic toys. There's another girl, I think in the next slide, who found a creative way to play with the historic toy. Not exactly what it was intended for, but you know, we like to have historic toys when we go to these fairs, just so that it's not simply, oh, look at this literature. Here's a group that's visiting the Jackson Homestead, and they're taking a look at our dollhouse there, and they were on a scavenger hunt through the museum. So I think they might have been looking for cats. We have a tiny little cat in the dollhouse, and then some cat images in portraits and other things around the museum. So that's always fun for kids when they visit.
Great. Can you expand a little bit more on the education programs that you work on? Is there any parts that you'd like to highlight?
So one of the things that I mentioned in the video is that the educators try to be more of the guide on the side than the sage on the stage. And that means leading programs where they really encourage the attendees to consider the questions that the people in the time period were facing. There's one, this is some Indian corn that was actually grown in the gardens at the Durant Kenrick House and grounds. And one of our programs, we use that kind of corn in colonial survival and civility. And the theme of that program is people have to cooperate with each other in a colonial settlement to be fed. And if they take all the food for themselves and don't share with people, then people are not going to make it through the winter. So the students learn how to trade and how to share in that one. There is another program about colonial life where people play roles and they take on the role of a sympathist with the English side or a colonist, somebody who wanted to break away as part of the American Revolution, and they need to justify the position they take. So that can be interesting, that it isn't just, here's what they did and here's how it happened. There's a lot more thinking involved in that. Same with Underground Railroad. We have a presentation about the Underground Railroad code called Journey on the Underground Railroad. And in that one, people need to understand the risks and the consequences of not only being a freedom seeker, but also taking in a freedom seeker. And you could risk a fine, you could risk losing your livelihood. The freedom seekers certainly risked their lives to leave slavery. So there's a lot for people to think about in that.
Great, great. It sounds like a really active and ambitious education program. So can you tell me something most people don't know about Newton?
Well, you stole my thunder. I was about to say most people don't realize it was part of Cambridge. But there is another fact that I think is completely emblematic of some of the difficulties of doing local history. And this is Newton's nickname. It's called the Garden City, which that's no secret. Most people know that. But we cannot figure out where that came from. We have looked and looked and looked about how did this come about. We find the first reference to it in a guidebook to Newton written in the late 19th century. We don't know where it came from. Maybe it was just out there. But I find that interesting that sometimes there are these facts that are associated with the town and nobody knows quite how they started. That's right, it's our colonial program. students are learning how to water crops in the 18th century there.
Yeah, I have to say that having lived in Cambridge for most of my life and have worked for the Cambridge Historical Society and the Cambridge Historical Commission, I have a bad habit of highlighting any connections to Cambridge that there are. I think people sometimes accuse me of suggesting that everything connects to Cambridge in some way. So sorry for stealing the thunder on that.
Oh, that's fine, yeah.
So are there any famous inventions that were made in Newton or were created by a Newton resident? And attached to that, I have a surprise question for you, which is, what do people who live, what do you call someone who lives in Newton? Like you call a person who lives in Cambridge a Cantabrigian. Is there a name for a Newton resident?
It's a Newtonian. Although I've seen people say Newtonite, but Newtonian is the more common one. And by the way, I don't know where people got Cantabrigian from Cambridge. At first, I didn't understand that the two were related. When I first heard Cantabrigian, I thought that was something else altogether. So that might be a historical mystery to solve. So in terms of inventors, there's a slide about Joseph Lee. He has a very interesting biography. He came out of South Carolina in the 1860s. He was born into slavery. He came to New England on vessels that were going up to the Boston area, ships. He learned how to cook on these ships. And when he came to the Boston area, he moved to Newton and he opened a bakery. And then from there, he grew his business to the point where he owned this big hotel in Auburndale. It's now no longer standing. It's near what's now the Woodland Golf Club. But he made a very successful career as a hotelier. He also invented a bread dough machine long before the ones that you could plug in and have your recipes in a book. He invented that to mix the dough and let it rise. He also invented a bread crumbing machine to make use of stale bread, create breadcrumbs from it. He got patents for both of those. He worked at Norumbega Park, which was an amusement park in Auburndale, after he closed his hotel. And in the end, he moved to Boston and he was a caterer there and had a restaurant in Squantum. So he's a really interesting person. The next slide will show the inventor Percy Spencer. And he is known as the inventor of the microwave oven. And he discovered it by accident. When my kids were little, we read this great book called Mistakes That Work. And this is an example of that. He was working with magnetrons, and he was near a magnetron with a chocolate bar in his pocket. And he realized the closer he got to the magnetron, the more the chocolate melted. So he thought, aha, there must be something to these waves coming out of the microtron. Long story short, he was able to harness that power into a microwave oven. At first, it was called a radar range, and it was enormous. It weighed, I think, 5,000 pounds. Anyway, it was definitely not your countertop appliance. There was one at Norumbega Park in Auburndale for a while, and then it became more of a household appliance when people figured out how to shrink it and make it the size and price that most people could fit into their kitchens. So that's certainly an interesting inventor.
Great. Yeah, and just to prove my point that I can link everything to Cambridge, I believe that he worked for Raytheon.
He did.
Which, when they were making the magnetrons, they were making them during World War II in an effort to produce radar and sonar for the Allied forces. But Raytheon actually started in Cambridge, and it started originally. It's now, I think, the third largest defense contractor in America, or something along that lines. It's a very large defense contractor. But it started out actually as a manufacturer of refrigerators.
Huh.
So go figure. So a refrigerator company that became a defense contractor invented the microwave oven by accident.
Right.
It's a weird world. And also Norumbega Park is also, to relate that to Cambridge, is in part referencing the story that Leif Erikson had settled in Cambridge. It's one of the names associated with the Viking settlements. So it's, again, I can guarantee you that I can link anything to Cambridge if I try hard enough. So,
That's right. All roads lead to Cambridge.
at least in my mind, maybe not in everyone else's mind. We have a couple different questions that people have submitted. If you're up for them, I'll just let you know what some of the questions are. One thing is just a very simple logistical question, which was a person asked, what is the title of the documentary about the abolitionists that you mentioned? Is it available for viewing?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I think it might be called The Abolitionists. It was part of a package. We got a grant from the Gilder Lehrman Foundation to show these films and have discussions about them. So it's traceable that way. I think it was also broadcast on PBS. But if you look up The Abolitionists, I'm pretty sure that was the title of the film.
So one person just asked, how big are these houses? They seem to be more spacious than some of the contemporary single-family homes, and definitely bigger than my apartment. Well, that's fair enough. But how did they compare to other houses of their period?
That's a good question. I don't know in terms of square footage. I know the Jackson Homestead, when it was built in 1809, was considered very modern for its time. And it has a fanlight window, which you could see when I was standing in front of the museum. It's that window that goes over the door and has different panes. It's almost like a semicircle above the door. Also at the time, the house had outbuildings that are now no longer part of the property, or some of them have been torn down. It was even bigger at one point. The house itself, given the number of people who lived in there, is surprisingly small. There are about, I think, 3 or 4 bedrooms upstairs. They're chock-a-block with our collection, mostly. And then there's a basement, which was often a work area. So I'm not sure it was a whole lot larger than other houses at the period. And the Durant-Kenrick house started as a farmhouse. And it was added onto, I know, once over time, and then the education wing was an addition. And it also doesn't seem particularly gigantic compared to some of the historic homes that are open, certainly in Newport and in areas like that. But some of the grand homes, even the Longfellow home in Cambridge, seems a lot larger, at least from the outside, than either of Historic Newton's historic properties.
This says, given the necessary secrecy required for the vigilance societies and the Underground Railroad, how difficult is it to conduct historical research, particularly with primary documentation?
It's really difficult, and we are lucky that we have this document that Ellen Jackson wrote, and in some of the side commentary that she wrote, she wasn't even going to put that into her annals of the old homestead until her sister said, oh, you really should talk about this. So also, I think that's an interesting lesson, and what we think is important now might not be what people think is important later. So if we're keeping journals or writing memoirs, it's better to err on the side of too much. Maybe it all won't get published, but just, copious notes. We also have a letter from a doctor that the family worked with who would bring people to their home as part of the railroad. That certainly is not often the case. There was tremendous secrecy. People didn't write things down. It was a very early whisper network, is what you might call now. So it is hard to do that research. It's also filled with rumor. And one thing that we've discovered is when people come to the Jackson Homestead, they'll say, well, where are the tunnels? And no, it didn't quite work like that. Well, where is the room they hid? It didn't quite work like that either. Basically, it was a safe house, and whoever came was able to stay there, probably right within the house with the family, and then move on. One of the advantages to it was right next to the railroad, which came through in the 1830s. And so people could be put on the trains very quickly and get out of town. So that was one way that it worked. I
know that there's in New England just a large number of incorrect stories of houses that were supposed to be on the Underground Railroad. I think that many homeowners wanted the idea that their house was historically a part of this big movement, this big this grand history, but often it's not true. So I think there's many myths about that. I know that when I worked at the Cambridge Historical Society there in the Hooper Lee Nichols house, and we received a letter from a former resident who was just indignant that we weren't highlighting the fact that the house was on the Underground Railroad, but there was no evidence at all to support the fact that the house was on the Underground Railroad. And it was just, that may have just been something somebody told you, but that wasn't actually really true. So Maureen wrote, how did the Jackson family become abolitionists?
We're not sure exactly. I mean, I'm not sure that they documented this light bulb moment, but what I'm thinking is that William Jackson, I mentioned, was very involved in temperance and was a very religious man. So I think it really had to do with his principles, and that he felt like it was the right thing to do, and that's probably what got him started with it. And then there were other abolitionists in the Boston area at the time that he could work with, notably William Lloyd Garrison, who was a personal friend of Francis Jackson, to the point where one of Garrison's children was named Francis Jackson Garrison. So I'm sure he had an influence on the family.
Gwen asks, were there any repercussions from slave owners against white people like William Jackson who provided shelter to runaway slaves if they were found out?
There would be repercussions. The people who ran the Underground Railroad stops could be fined or could be shunned, which is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but it could have an economic cost if nobody wanted to use their business anymore, or if they weren't allowed to run their business anymore. So there were risks associated with it. And we get into some of that in the Underground Railroad program.
Okay. Lewis asked, when Newton was settled in 1630, were there any Native Americans in the area? Does any of the programming cover Native Americans?
That's a really good question, because for a long time the focus on Newton's history talked about John Eliot, who was a preacher who came from England to the Boston area in the early 17th century, and he was determined to, he proselytized all the time, and the first group that listened to him was a group in the Newton area. So that was often told as Newton's founding story, but we like to look back at who was here before John Eliot arrived. And we have a program called Forests and Farm. It looks at the different ways that the groups use the land. How did the Native people use it? How did they understand what natural resources were? And how did they shepherd those? And then the colonists, how did they use the natural resources? What did they do? So that's an example of one way in which we talk about Native history. We've also done some walking tours. The group that was converted by John Eliot lived right near the Durant-Kenrick house. And so we talk about what the landscape was like at the time when they were there and what kind of life they were leading.
Is this the same John Eliot who published the Eliot Indian Bible?
Yes, it is. And that is, his group ended up being removed to Natick. Mm-hmm. And then, unfortunately, there was basically genocide when that group was then moved to Deer Island during King Philip's War. Yes, it's that same group. And Eliot was just determined that he wanted to convert the Native people to Christianity. And one of the ways that he wanted to do that was to preach in their native language. And he was able to not only translate the Bible, but have it published. And that leads back to Cambridge. It was published in Cambridge, and a Native person who was working as a printer in Cambridge was part of the translation and printing process.
Right. And it also leads back to MHS, of course, since we have a copy of that. So Patricia said, you mentioned that we know about the Jackson Homestead connections to the Underground Railroad due to a book written by William Jackson's daughter in the 1890s. That was a period post-Civil War when a number of white writers were writing nostalgic accounts of the Underground Railroad, creating accounts of white heroes helping black fugitives. Scholars now think that this reflects a skewed picture of an effort that happened largely through the efforts and leadership of black people. Does any of this reimagining of the role of black versus white activists in the Underground Railroad show up in how you present the homestead? It's a long question.
No, it's actually a good question. And I got into a little of that when I was showing the Confronting Our Legacy exhibit. And we do talk about the black contributors to the Underground Railroad and to the abolition movement. I think often history gets skewed in that way because the records left behind that we look at were left behind by the white people who were keeping them and stashing them away in their homes. The Jackson Homestead became a history museum in the 1950s, and we had a trove of material to work with when it became a history museum. That play I mentioned that was shown at Durant Kenrick House really talked about the multiracial nature of abolition. And then we did a program, I mentioned that Frederick Douglass had come and stayed with Francis Jackson, and that movement that Francis Jackson was involved in was also multiracial. So we do get at it. We're trying not to make the story of the Underground Railroad revolve around the Jacksons. Yes, it happened at their house, but there were many, many other participants in it.
That's great. And of course, all historians face the challenge of the records that survive are the records that you use, and the records that survive from, say, the 17th century or the 18th century, very often were the records of the highly educated people, and those tended to be the wealthy people. So it's difficult to find those hidden histories, and I think everyone is struggling with that. So I think we probably have time for one last question. So William wrote, how much of the building stock, residential and or commercial, remains in Newton from the time period of the Jackson Homestead? Or antebellum America, which time period is particularly well represented in the architectural fabric of the city?
Aha! This question is a good one for every year we have a house tour, the Newton House Tour, that focuses on historic homes and renovations. And there are definitely some examples of antebellum architecture in Newton. Not so much colonial anymore. The Durant Kenrick House is a good example of colonial. A lot of those have been torn down. They just aren't working for people in the modern era, both aesthetically and in terms of interior layout. What you see are some that were built like around the time William Jackson did his subdivision. Some of those are still left, and that is 1830s, 1840s. And those are around. There's a huge number of Victorian homes. I think Newton is really known for those. A lot of them are clustered on West Newton Hill, which was developed in the 1880s, 1890s, as the train really became more popular as a commuter rail. People were able to move out of the city. Newton has, well, Newton's kind of wide, but its furthest point away from Boston is 10 to 12 miles, depending on where you go. And so that part opened up after the trains came through and brought in the wealthy people who were merchants in Boston who could afford these custom-made houses. So Newton's definitely known for those. More recently, there are a few examples of mid-century modern built in the 1950s. But I would say, that's probably the Victorians are certainly well represented in that one neighborhood. Great,
and that, of course, sort of matches the census data that I showed, which was that there's a large expansion in the population at the end of the 19th century, so in the Victorian era. So you would assume that a lot of the houses that were built for those groups. And when the population was much, much smaller in the early 19th or the 18th century, there's just weren't that many houses, just fewer people. So that makes a lot of sense. I
do want to just mention that, Newton does have its working class areas, and that there were villages where there were cottages for the workers at the mills. So it's not all grand and glorious. There are different kinds of architecture. Many different kinds of people lived there. So.
I want to thank you very much for taking the time to create the tour and spending your Friday afternoon with us. I think this was a great program, and we had up to 125 people signed on during the program, which is pretty impressive. Would have definitely been an uncomfortable tour in the house with 125 people. So I think this is a good example of the use of the digital technology. So I'm going to just share my screen here for a second. Again, thank everybody for joining us. I just wanted to also highlight that the Massachusetts Historical Society is still collecting, and during these unusual times of COVID where we're doing virtual house tours, we are also collecting people's experiences of going through the COVID-19 experience. So if people would like to have their own experience of this documented, you're encouraged to come to the Mass Historical website, which is masshist.org, and it's pretty easy to find the COVID-19 program there. And the memories that people share will become a part of our permanent collections. And thank you again, Clara, for sharing.
Thank you.